Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 17th, 2024, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 electoral map based on polling data in a number of key and crucial battleground states and what it might suggest for the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. On your screen right now, we have 538 toss-up electoral votes that are yet to be allocated, and many of which have polls on a consistent basis in some of these states. Now, to be very transparent, not every state has a set number of polls that have been conducted over the past couple of months. Many of them do not have polls that date far back and wide that provide us enough purview to say that this is a consistent trend line and something that I would feel comfortable presenting to you. Some of the more recent polls, though, I think I give a little bit more grace to because they come at a time where we have solidified party nominees, a general understanding of how this presidential election, at least in some capacity, is going to go. And I think the recent polls are far more suggestive of what we might see in November rather than polls that might have been taken 6 months ago, a year ago, even if they have been conducted in some of these states. And so we won't be going through every single state when it comes down to polling margin, largely because there isn't enough resources and money spent on some of these states, and they really only focus on battleground states. But we do have some gems here that can show us some interesting results, states like Washington and New York and Virginia that don't typically receive that much polling data in a presidential election like this one, where we actually see it this time around. And so what I'm going to do is characterize all of our states from the 2020 presidential election, and then we're going to move back into, generally speaking, what our electoral map is going to look like with all of the polling metrics taken into account. And so we're going to characterize all of the Biden states, all of the Trump states from 2020, and pretty much get to a 303 electoral map that we saw for President Biden back in 2020. It was actually 306, but new electoral map, new electoral ratings, new electoral map, new vote totals. And so that brings Donald Trump up just slightly to 235 and Joe Biden at 303. Now, the states that we have polls in are the states of Washington, New York, Virginia, Nevada, Maine. We're actually going to go ahead and keep Maine second. We're going to do Maine at large. That's where we see some of the polls coming out of the state. Texas, New Hampshire, Ohio, Iowa, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Minnesota also as well. And so that brings us to a point where it's roughly 255 electoral votes that we're taking a look at. Also Colorado and New Mexico joining the group, actually, so roughly 270 electoral votes. Outside of that, we don't really have that many mainstream polls being conducted. I think the reason for that is just the fact that when we look at what matters for a Trump versus Biden rematch, we're often talking about battleground states, and some of them just simply do not have the funding or the necessary components and resources to get into these states, and so some of them just really aren't worth the money. For instance, a state like Wyoming, which is a very conservative state, and we know that, there wouldn't be a need to poll some of those states unless there was maybe a competitive Republican primary where they could hitch on a random presidential election poll, but generally speaking, that's not what we're focused on in this race. And so 270 electoral votes, though, gives us a general idea of what the polls are suggesting. Is there a narrowing of the race? Are there better numbers for President Biden, for President Trump, compared to the last race? And so I think what we are really trying to get out of this is a better understanding of the current state of polls, the current state of the election, and just trusting entirely to what the polls are telling us. And so we're going to go state by state. We're going to look from a range primarily of less competitive to more competitive. It's not perfect. Some of these are just a bit jumbled here, but generally what I'm trying to do is fill out this map with the least amount of surprises as possible until we get to the battleground states where you may agree or disagree with the characterizations that the polls currently give us. So as a baseline reminder, 142 for Joe Biden right now, 126 for President Trump. So President Biden, President Trump, very close, but neither within reach of the 270. We will see that extend as we get closer and closer across this map. So we'll start off with the state of Washington, states that Clinton won by 16, Biden won by 20. Biden currently is ahead by, on average here, you're talking roughly 8 points, roughly 9 points. We're going to go ahead and characterize that as a likely Democratic state. I know it might be surprising to some, but Washington is a state that is pretty solid for the Democrats normally, but it looks like there might be some bleeding this time around. New York is the one that I have as a unique point of interest. Siena College traditionally does very, very strong polls. The Hill and Emerson College also traditionally do very strong polls. They seem to suggest that New York is a state that Biden is only ahead in by 8 points. Now, to put that into perspective, that would be similar to a state like Oklahoma becoming Trump plus 8. What is a Biden state plus 25, plus 30 has now been reduced down to being a very strong state for a very strong swing in favor of President Trump, but still a somewhat strong state for President Biden. It just really goes to show that there is, in fact, according to these polls in New York, some bleeding on the Democratic Party side. Of course, I do think eventually New York will be a safe Democratic state. But that's besides the point. We're really only focused at some of these more mainstream numbers from the polls. So New York, Washington characterized, go into the Biden column, bring them up to 182. The next state we're going to take a look at is the state of Maine here. This is an at-large region here. So they actually do what we call ranked choice voting. Essentially, what you're looking at is that in the first round, people are able to rank however they want. Green Party candidates, Libertarian candidates, Republican, Democrat, and then it's a process of elimination, but you rank beyond your first choice. And so whoever you decide to rank second, their vote will move up. If they're also eliminated, then it goes to your third choice. Essentially, the whole concept is that no votes are wasted. It's one voice, one vote. And so that's what you're trying to see here on the Democratic side, Republican side. That's what they're figuring out in Maine. Right now, it puts Biden ahead by roughly 2 points in the state of Maine. So it actually narrows down this arguably otherwise solid Democratic state down to being a very narrow state for President Biden. So he is up to 184, but still closer than it should be, at least in years past. Moving over to the next state, the state of Texas. Right now, President Trump has an advantage here by roughly 9 points. He won it by 6 points in the last election. So definitely a step up for Republicans. That brings up with a whopping 40 electoral votes in the GOP column to President Trump at 166. And so here we are, 166, 184. Let's move on to some other more competitive battleground states. Virginia is the one that I'm looking at right now. Biden is ahead by 2 points. Recent polls show a tie here. This would be shocking if Virginia went to the Republican Party, largely because Virginia went to President Biden back in 2020 by 10.1%. So the narrowest margins are coming in states that Biden is winning or has won in, excessive margins in the last election. This could show a complete and total collapse of a Biden campaign if it was to be a 2-point margin or even a tie in the state of Virginia, which is why many Democrats are a bit, unwilling to say that these numbers are entirely valid. And I think there certainly are points of concern to say Virginia cannot be this close while Florida is just narrowly in the Trump column. There's definitely reasons to believe that not all the data is consistent and makes sense. But of course, we're just basing it on that right now. So I always have to caution that. So we acknowledge that. But Virginia is a lean Democratic state. The next state we're going to take a look at is actually another state that was at one point in time pretty okay for President Biden. Most recently has moved over into the Biden plus 2 to 3 point margin. Still a victory in Minnesota, but he won the state by 7 points in the last race. So a 3 to 4 to 5 point reversion from where it was back in 2020. Not the best look for the incumbent president, but still puts him in the victory column on the Minnesota front, Virginia front, New York, Washington at the same time, acknowledging that the polls right now don't show as strong of margins as we saw back in 2020. And so here we are with 165 toss-up electoral votes remaining. Let's move over to the states of New Mexico and the states of Colorado, the states of New Mexico and Colorado. New Mexico currently has Biden ahead by roughly 8 points. That's a likely margin and not much of a bleed from what we saw in the last race. Biden, I think, won it by maybe 10, 11 points. And so, yes, a reduction in support makes sense to a state across the southern border. We've seen some reversions in support amongst Latino voters when it comes down to head-to-head polls. So New Mexico being Biden plus 8 makes sense. Still pretty strong, though, for the incumbent president. Colorado, however, we're seeing a state that Biden won by 14 in the last race, narrowed down to being Biden plus 6.5. And so Colorado, New Mexico, still again in the Biden column, but narrow. And Colorado, quite substantively more narrow from the last race. And so definitely want to keep that in mind also as we're looking at some of these states. We're seeing some similar regions swing in similar ways. So New Mexico, Colorado, Biden states, but still, more competitive than they were in the last race. Moving over to the next state, we're going to take a look at New Hampshire, where Biden currently has a 5.3% advantage. Now, New Hampshire is uniquely interesting. We've seen very, very, very little bleeding across the state from the 2020 election, and I think a lot of it has to do with the demographic makeup of what we've seen in New Hampshire. In states with very high white voter populations, New Hampshire being one of the whitest states in the country, you've seen the least amount of bleeding for President Biden. A lot of the bleeding has been led primarily amongst minority voters, low propensity voters also from 2020, not even necessarily minority voters, but just really you found that a lot of that base that was not as inspired to vote in elections prior to 2020 that turned out in 2020, some of them are turning on President Biden or just simply not even necessarily turning, but are really just, pulling down away, just not voting, not as enthusiastic to vote for a variety of different reasons. I think in this instance, you see that New Hampshire, being a Biden plus 5 state, makes sense when you look at the demographics. It makes sense also, too, based on the trend line we've seen. This is a state that has had the general election season practically in full force in the state because of the Republican and Democratic primaries, and so they've been hyper aware of this presidential election, unlike many other states that have yet to even see a single campaign stop and may not even see one throughout the remainder of the election cycle. And so New Hampshire goes into the Democratic column, brings President Biden up to 226. Now moving over to the state of Ohio, President Trump has a lead here by roughly 10 points across the state. Also in the state of Florida, a 7.6% advantage. And so what this means for these two states is that they are pretty strong for the Republican Party. Florida becomes, a Trump state, 7.6. It was a Trump state by 3 in 2020, and so a 4-point growth for President Trump, 5-point growth in Ohio, roughly a 2-point growth from 2020 as well. Regardless, though, bump up President Trump's numbers quite substantively up to 213, President Biden at 226. And so the race is starting to narrow, and we're getting down to our key and crucial states. The state that I have yet to characterize that might stick out like a sore thumb is the state of Iowa, and that's because we actually got our first ever poll in the state of the cycle with all the candidates included. And so I think right now, seeing it, President Trump has an 18-point advantage. The reason why I wanted to wait on this one is because it now makes Iowa a safe red state. So forget lean, forget likely, forget tilt, certainly. Move it over to the safe Republican column. That's where Iowa is right now, according to the polls. And so definitely want to keep a closer look on that as we get closer and closer to the election. Is that going to change? Does that suggest something further about the future of this country, about the future of some of these battleground states? Right now, I'd say that while Iowa can absolutely be a safe red state in some contexts, I don't know if I believe the presidential election is the one that it will be. But of course, time will tell, and we will see if Iowa sees consistent trend lines in favor of President Trump, and it very well may be. It used to be an Obama state by 6 in 2012, larger in 2008, immediately went over to Trump in 2016. So there has certainly been a lot of Obama voters that voted for Trump again, will vote for Trump even more, and then maybe you'll find that more voters are moving over into the Republican column. And so now we're down to 93 electoral votes across the 7 very important battleground states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. And the polls here, I think, might also tell a grander story about the state of the race right now, according to the polls. So Arizona is the first one here. We have it in alphabetical order. The state of Arizona. Right now, Donald Trump has a 4.6% advantage across the state, leaning very heavily over into being a likely margin. I think that is a very strong showing for President Trump. I think it goes to show just where the support has been inspired by, and also, again, that whole idea and concept of bleeding, specifically amongst minority voters, Latino voters, a huge portion of the population in Arizona. We find that President Biden has lost support amongst that region, the Sun Belt, and I also think, too, in Arizona specifically. The next state is the state of Georgia, a state that Trump currently has a lead of by 4.8% across the state. That also shows a very close race. Not a very close race, a very wide expansion from the last election. So in 2020, Biden won the state by 0.2. This time around, Trump is expected to win by nearly 5 points, nearly identical to what he got back in 2016. And so amongst the remaining states, we have Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada. Let's move over to the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan right now currently has Trump ahead by 0.3, but it is the state that has seen the most whiplash in election polls over the past couple of weeks. At different periods of time, Biden was ahead, Trump was ahead. Actually, no, Biden has not been ahead for quite some time, but we did think that at one point Biden was going to take the lead, and maybe it takes another poll out of the state that shows Biden with a narrow advantage. Right now, Trump, though, has a very, very, very narrow advantage that is also eerily reminiscent of the 2016 presidential election. The next state we're going to take a look at is the state of Nevada, which also has shown a substantial reversion in support to making now Nevada a likely red state according to the polls. A consistent lead for Trump at one point in time was 9 points across the state. Today it stands to be narrower than that, but still an advantage that the Trump campaign arguably is likely proud of based on where they are right now. So that brings Nevada 267, Trump at 267, Biden at 226. Let's go ahead and take a look at the remaining states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. North Carolina is the next state, which currently has President Trump ahead by 5.3% as well, which means it is a likely Republican state. That bumps up Trump over the finish line, 283 electoral votes. We have 2 more states remaining: Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. We'll go to Pennsylvania, and then we'll go to Wisconsin and do some more high-level takeaways. And so Pennsylvania right now, Trump is ahead by 2.3. In Wisconsin, Trump is ahead by 0.1, the narrowest state that we've seen of this cycle. Not as much whiplash in the polls, largely a narrow race because of the Quinnipiac University poll that shows Biden ahead by 6. Point being, though, Trump ahead by 0.1, Trump ahead by 2.3 in Pennsylvania. That makes Wisconsin a lean red state. It makes Pennsylvania tilt red state, and Wisconsin a lean red state in the state of Pennsylvania. And so that brings us to our electoral map here: 312 for Donald Trump, 226 for President Biden. Arguably, a lot of the trends that we are seeing in some of these battleground states are being replicated in swing states. And it goes to show that right now, President Trump, according to the polls, has an advantage over President Biden. And so at this point, you're going to need to see a lot change between now and November in the polls if you're to rely on them heavily for how you might predict the outcome of this election. I do want to say, I do think that the polls are useful in some capacities. I think 2022 made me very apprehensive to treat them as the gold standard, even after 2016 and 2020, where maybe if we just consistently believed that the polls were underestimating President Trump, that in actuality, we would see a result that was close to just a simple change in the direction of the right. But 2022 showed us that a simple change in the direction of the right would have predicted a far more substantial victory for Republicans than what they actually ended up with. In fact, the majority of polls, 90% of them in battleground states, underestimated Democrats in these super, super important races, and it completely threw us for a loop. This time around, we could see something similar, because the national averages and some of these statewide averages, a lot of it just doesn't make sense. For instance, when you take a look at a state like Nevada being likely red, but a state like Pennsylvania, which was narrower than Nevada in 2020, being just lean red, it doesn't make sense. When you see a state like Wisconsin, which was narrower than Nevada, 0.6 in 2020, Nevada was 2.4, being 6 points off from what you see in Nevada. That also doesn't make a lot of sense. There are reasons to believe that these polls just are simply out of whack. States like Washington, in no reality is Biden only winning by 8. Or in states like New York, there's no reality in which Biden is only winning by 7. These are solid Democratic states and will continue to be so this coming November. So something is off, and something is weird about the state of the race when it comes down to opinion polls. But this is what they present. 312 to 226, President Trump to President Biden. It may explain the confidence that the Donald Trump campaign has, and maybe the underconfidence that the Biden campaign has as well. This race and the competitiveness of it all has made us completely apprehensive at trusting a lot of the data that we see, because a lot of it stands in direct contrast with many other fundamentals that often are predictive outcomes of an election as well, just like polls are. Things like fundraising data and where you are getting the fundraising and where you're seeing enthusiastic bases versus not. This election is a whirlwind, and there's no perfect way to predict it. The polls are a piece of the puzzle, but they might not be all of it. If 2020 and 2022 showed us, it's that the polls can underestimate both Republicans and Democrats. The question is this cycle, are they spot on or are they underestimating in either direction? While only time will tell, I think that is very important to leave with this. The polls are not going to be perfect, and to treat them as such is to do a huge injustice to a lot of the other reasons to believe that analytics, encompass far more than just what some of these polls suggest. A lot of these polls, too, are also partisan. A lot of the polls are being employed by the RNC and the DNC to go ahead and get the numbers out there. And a lot of the times that comes with inherent bias and leading questions and really just gauging the electorate in a way that might not be the same way a ballot box would gauge them or a mail-in ballot or whatever it might be. And so polls are not perfect. They're not a perfect science, and all they do show a snapshot in time. And I think they accurately predict that Donald Trump would win a state like Georgia or Arizona or Nevada or Florida today. They may not be as accurate this coming November. And so tracking them is very important. Seeing how they change over time, maybe a national shift could suggest something in favor of President Biden or in favor of President Trump. We would need to keep an eye out for it because these are very important polls. These are very important states, but sometimes they don't always add up. And in this instance, I'm a bit more apprehensive to believe them, but I do think there's merit in understanding them and using them as one piece of the puzzle in understanding this very, very difficult election, to say the least. A repetitive one, but still, nonetheless, more difficult. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist from my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.